Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another live developer Q&A here at the Blizzard offices. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, joined here today once again by none other than Assistant Game Director Ian Hazzikostas. How's it going, man? How you feeling?
It's been great. It's been a good day. It's been a good week. It's been just very, very fun, very exciting. Both playing Legion ourselves and taking a step back and just seeing how launch went, how everybody has been reacting to the game, and just the overall excitement and enthusiasm around it. It's an awesome time around the offices right now for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I guess before we get into the questions, Legion launched just a week and a half ago now. How are you feeling about the overall state of the game right now? Because obviously it was a really good launch. Like, things went really, really well. How are you guys feeling right now about the overall package?
Great. I think we've seen people getting to max level, starting to get into World Quest, get into a lot of these systems that if they hadn't played the beta or really been super engaged with the beta, were new to that, like figuring out the details of these systems was new to most people. And there is a ton of content out there, and I think the experience of hitting max level and almost being overwhelmed by all that there is to do, but in a good way, is one that we're very proud of. And it's been fun seeing people kind of hit that point,
nice,
and realize like the journey is really just beginning. It's definitely not an end point when you hit max level, and it's a whole world of things to do, a whole world of quests.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely how I've been feeling as well. But let's go ahead and get into these questions. First
Sounds
one
good.
here comes from Ishalizan. I think that's how you pronounce this. Question is, with the limited number of followers, why is there a cap? And will we get more of them as the expansion goes on?
Okay, so on this, a couple things. So I think, yes, I would expect that we will have more champions as the expansion goes on in some form or another. It's definitely, a part of one of the vehicles we have for storytelling when it comes to your class order and your fight against the Legion. But I agree there's definitely some awkwardness in having 8 champions but only being able to use 5, especially when you unlock those last 2, when you kind of finish your Order Hall campaign, at least in the shipping game, and you realize like, oh, right, I just got 2 champions. I have to disable 2 champions before I can do any missions. The reason for that, though, is there's some tension between wanting a certain number of champions to kind of feel like we're fleshing out the, Knights of the Round Table or the circle that you're building as leader of your order from a storytelling POV, but then also not wanting the mission system to grow beyond a certain scope, beyond a certain scale. And I think if we let you use all 8 of your followers, for example, then either you'd be able to trivially run all of the missions that are presented to you every day, which is kind of odd. There isn't really much choice or decision making there. Or we'd have to increase the number of missions that we're presenting, and then we start to creep closer to that, Warlord's garrison territory, which is something we consciously wanted to stay away from. We carried forward a lot of the mechanics and a lot of, the philosophies, but we wanted it to be a much smaller piece of the overall expansion package, and that means that it's something that you check in on, once or twice a day, or you pull out your handy Legion companion app and take care of that way, and not something where you're micromanaging tons of different champions.
Nice. Yeah, it's I also kind of agree. It feels a little bit weird right now.
Yeah.
But especially like as time goes on, I think it's going to start to make a lot more sense. Cool. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Wave Crash. This was definitely a popular question. Who asked, why nerf Rockfeather Kite and Brulfist Idol? If you don't like the quote-unquote free-flying interaction, surely you could have just nerfed the Idol and left the Kite the way it was. And it's interesting, we've seen a lot of people saying, why didn't you just nerf the Kite? Why didn't you just nerf the Idol? And back and forth. Yeah. So what's your sort of take on this situation?
So a couple of pieces to this. I think we deliberately didn't recreate Aviana's Feather exactly. The Emerald Winds toy is kind of in the same vein, but we wanted to give it a different interaction. It's more potent in some ways in terms of giving you control over your movement in the air, but obviously less potent in the sense of not knocking you up super high and letting you get that starting point of your trajectory. So once we realized that this combination of toys could recreate that exact experience, that felt like a sort of awkward workaround for something that we had consciously been trying to take a step back from. Now, more broadly, why nerf these things at all, right? Why nerf the Kite? It's not that we have an objection to that mechanic, right? It's not like we want everyone to always walk everywhere, because there are things like goblin gliders in the game, and it's actually in many ways to preserve the value of those things. It's one of the cool things about, one of the things engineers sell that people want to stock up on, especially when you're adventuring in a zone like High Mountain or Stormheim, are goblin gliders, because they're convenient, because they're fun to use. Well, when we introduce this readily available toy that is just superior in pretty much every way, I mean, it was a shorter cooldown and offered the same functionality, that feels like it really steps on part of what makes engineers special. It also steps on part of what makes things like demon hunters with glide special, or priests with levitate, or other forms of slow fall, and so on. I think, if we wanted to get rid of the gameplay entirely, we obviously would be cutting a ton of other things. That's not what this was about. It was about something that, a toy that encroached on class and profession space. And toys, I think, tend to be like, most toys are cosmetic, and I think it's always there's like this awkward line that we sometimes toe where toys become functional, and you start to see, step one of a Legion guide is, well, go to High Mountain as your first zone, go to this spot, this spot, this spot, and this spot for these treasures with these coordinates.
Yeah.
And that's the most efficient way to begin. It's like, well, that's not really what toys are supposed to be about. I mean, we have powerful utility and other tools available, but treasures and toys are not necessarily the best way of delivering that type of functionality.
Cool. Yeah, and even with the 15-minute cooldown, I've still found the kite to be very, very useful in cases where maybe I don't want to use a goblin glider at the moment. So.
Exactly. I mean, it depends on how often that you're finding that situation comes up.
Yeah.
If it's not super frequently, then it still has your needs covered. And if you want it more commonly, be a demon hunter, buy a goblin glider.
Yeah.
Do one of those things.
Cool. It's nice for engineering as well, just to make sure that they have something they can sell more readily.
Exactly.
All right. Moving on here. Question from ESL Nachtkind FX, I think is how this is pronounced, who says, Dungeon XP feels low. Any plans to change this to level our alts faster?
So there's a ton of experience that's currently awarded from the quests that send you into dungeons at the end of each zone. Like, those quests will give you like a fifth of a level. It's one of the biggest chunks of experience you're ever going to come across leveling in Legion. So that's very deliberate. We wanted doing the dungeons to feel rewarding. At the same time, we did consciously take a little step back from grinding dungeons being, an efficient way to level, just because it's actually a little bit of a trap. Like, if you were to just chain run dungeons all the way to 110, well, you would need to go back and do chunks of the zones for little reward to unlock world quests or, other core pieces of the game. Now, in terms of, pace of leveling and alts and all that, that's something, as with any expansion, we're going to keep an eye on over the course of the expansion and tweak as needed. But so far, I think we're pretty happy with the amount of time it's taken to get to max level, the percentage of the total available content that's been out there that you have to do. If you're being super thorough, you may hit 110 without even finishing 3 of the 4 zones. If you're kind of skipping around more and just hitting up the main storylines, you might do all 4. Depends on how many dungeons you do, depends on whether you do some PvP. There's a lot of different ways to get there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there's definitely been cases in the past where, like, I've leveled an alt through doing nothing but dungeons, and then I got to max and I'm like, oh crap, that I have a bunch of other stuff that I need to do. And with the world quest unlock, I can see why that would be an issue. All right, let's move on. Question here from Loctino. I did take a look at the Twitch chat before we started, and I feel like a lot of people are wondering this right now. The question is, Warlocks? Question mark?
They're a class. I mean, I'm not sure this is the only question that they had. I don't know if you can just put a question mark at the end of a word and that automatically makes it a question. No, okay, so yes, understood. There are some warlocks who are not super happy right now. A few things to sort of discuss in addressing some of the broader concerns we've seen raised. One really valid point and a good point that I've seen come up multiple times is the amount of ramp that a lot of different warlocks feel like they have across the different specs, especially, when your experience is you're in the outdoor world or you're in PvP, you often feel like it takes you so long to get to your full potential that is very limiting, and by the time you reach that potential, thing you needed it for is over.
Right.
It's,
Especially
whether it's
in like 5-mans right now. And
exactly, right. Or like if you're a demonology warlock, you need to build up resources. You need to get your demons out. Once you kind of hit that peak of all of your things lined up, well, unless you're fighting a long dungeon boss or a raid boss, which isn't even available right now in the game, like the circumstances around you have probably changed. It's very reminiscent of, makes me think back to almost like 8 years ago where rogues were when deadly poison was something that's stacked up, and rogues needed to get to 5 stacks of deadly poison on a new target, build up combo points, get up things like slice and dice, get up something like rupture on their target, and like there was layered ramping mechanics. So something we've been discussing in the short term that we think we can do to address some of these issues. We're looking at a hotfix potentially within the next week that would change the default number of soul shards from 1 to 3. So that just walking around in the outdoor world, instead of refilling to 1, you'd be able to start pretty much every fight with 3 soul shards, which lets you kind of jump right into the action much more on a wider array of encounter lengths.
Okay.
There's the bigger issues and questions with something like demonology, where we'd love to try to get to some of that like Diablo 2 Necromancer vibe, where if you could build up, an army of imps or an army of pets and carry that through multiple packs in the outdoor world or multiple pulls in the outdoor world, right? Rather than having it be such a narrow window where you need to use empowerment before you lose it. That could create a feel where it's like, okay, maybe as you go into a world quest area, for example, you're kind of building up your army over the first couple of things you're fighting, but then you can make up for it by really plowing through the next few things, which doesn't really feel like it's possible now. So I mean, that's one thing we've definitely heard that was a valid concern. Other general concerns, I have seen a lot about mobility, about reliance on hard casts, definitely from a PvP perspective, which is also tied into mobility. Some of that I think we're not likely to change, and that's a reflection of our philosophy when it comes to classes in Legion. We would much rather double down on strengths than try to shore up weaknesses. And because when you try to shore up weaknesses, it's an easy thing to do, right? Coming up with an ability or changing things to give warlocks more mobility or more instants, more things they can do on the move. That's not a hard problem to solve, but what it does is it kind of tends towards that homogenization where when weaknesses go away, it's like if everyone's sort of equally good at everything, then what distinguishes classes from each other? So what if we'd rather... We're not saying things are perfect by any means. It's more that, let's say that warlocks are less mobile and they are more tanky rather than evasive, right? Whereas in theory, the mage is hard to pin down. They're squishy if you can do so, but they're going to root you and blink away. They're going to, be hard to get a hold of. The warlock, okay, you can pin them down, but they should be tankier. They should be much more resilient in a way that reflects what the essence of a warlock is all about. So going forward, we'd rather look to build on those strengths and get all of you to a place where you are powerful, you are fearsome, but relying on those strengths. Other things I've heard, I know there's a lot of destruction warlocks who aren't huge fans of their mastery because of an RNG feel to it. And that's like... It's hard to argue with the psychology. I mean, I get that if you don't like the way it feels, I can't say, well, you're wrong. You should feel differently. Your brain should work differently, because, I mean, that's very valuable feedback. On our end, we think of it, though, as it's kind of like crit, right? I mean, it's very easy to look at, oh, well, I have this mastery that makes my Chaos Bolt have a huge variance in the damage that it does. But in most situations, you are casting many Chaos Bolts over a longer period of time, and it's going to average out. The same way, I mean, inherently, crit at its base is a 100% variance between a crit and a non-crit, and even higher than that for some specs that have crit damage boosters. And that's not seen as something that's crippling. It averages out in the long run. Obviously, there's some cases, like in PvP, if you have a very narrow burst window, hitting the low end of your range versus the high end of your range may be frustrating. But the flip side there is that also having that variability, having that high end versus just kind of splitting the difference every time, means that other times you will get that burst kill that otherwise would have eluded you.
Yeah, and I think in PvP, I think there's a lot of interesting gameplay in the sort of element of, oh crap, that was a huge Chaos Bolt. He's just suddenly down to like 30% health, and being able to have the sort of like mental gymnastics that you go through to be able to say, okay, he's low now, like right now is the time that we need to try to go for a kill, versus, okay, we Chaos Bolted and he's down to 60%, he's probably fine, let's back off for just a second. So I personally find that really interesting.
And I think, and one other general point, and I'm trying to not. I don't want to sound patronizing in any way, though I'm sure some will take it that way. Appreciate the feedback, and I get when people are frustrated or unhappy with the state of their class, with the state of their spec, and you're just, you want to express that frustration. It's actually it's very unconstructive in a lot of ways to communicate that frustration through spamming up threads or just trying to start petitions. I actually went to the Warlock class forums on multiple occasions knowing, like, okay, Warlocks are clearly upset about something. What is it that they're upset about? Is there a summary of issues somewhere? And when 95% of the posts on the forum are just general, petitions and signed and let's delete and time to re-roll, it actually clouds our ability to get at the heart of the issue.
Yeah. Like, not that we can't tell that there's an issue.
Right.
It's
we're actually trying to figure out, like,
Yeah.
and because a lot of the times also, there are all sorts of conflicting feedback. It's you ask 10 people, they're all unhappy, but they're unhappy for different reasons that are often directly opposed to each other. We're trying to make things better for person A would actually make them worse for person B. So we're trying to understand kind of the broad base of shared issues. Things like ramp up time. It's like, yeah, we take a step back and look at that and can quickly realize that's a really valid concern. They're right. Let's see what we can do about it. That's effective advocacy, right? I would love to get linked more substantive, well-written, well-supported posts that feel like they command a majority of the community's respect and fewer hashtags. Like a hashtag of fix whatever. That okay. Like, I'm not sure what we're supposed to do with that. We'd like to, but it's not giving us anything to act upon.
Yeah.
And often obfuscates the issue.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously we play the game as well, but our experiences aren't always the same as everybody else's experiences because everybody's experiences are different. So yeah, no, I think that's, and this isn't the first time stuff like this has happened either.
No,
so
of course not.
Don't want to be sounding like we're picking on the Warlocks too much here, but just something to keep in mind for feedback for the future. Like one post that clearly lays out all of the different pain points is so much more useful for our purposes in actually helping you guys out and getting things fixed.
Yeah, and we're going to read more than the one post. It also sparks discussion.
Sure. Yeah.
Because clearly, as I said, like when someone tries to summarize their concerns, other members of the community are naturally going to disagree with some of those things, and that's fine. It leads to healthy discussion that we can actually dig into.
Yeah.
That's all we're looking for, really.
Cool. So moving on, we have another balance related question here. It comes from Dumat, I believe, whose question is: Mythics seem to favor cleave specs like Demon Hunter and Windwalker. Any plans to boost the underperforming caster cleavers? So I guess this kind of ties into Warlocks a little bit too, because like Affliction is obviously well known as a sort of caster cleave, even Destruction to some extent. But like Shadow Priest as well, Balance Druid. How do we feel about them?
Sure. I mean, multi-dotting is something that there's room for a lot of strength in a lot of situations. Clumped up groups of mobs that you're often engaging on the move quickly with little ramp up time obviously aren't necessarily ideal multi-dot situations, but when we get into various dungeon encounters or certainly raid encounters to follow where you have multiple things that are split up, all of a sudden the melee cleave can't cleave at all, and some of those ranged multi-dot specs are going to excel. So I mean, we're seeing melee doing well in dungeons right now, and I think given the importance of dungeons in Legion, that's not a bad thing at all. I think historically there's often been this melee stigma and this sense that for PvE in particular, really, you should just bring groups of all range casters because they're just easier, they're more versatile, you can handle more things, you can be less threatened by some mechanics that are PvE AoEs and what have you. And I mean, range still have all of those strengths in terms of quick target switching, not, having to be in the thick of things in terms of short range threats and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily bother us that melee have this niche and melee have this strength. That said, I mean, balance in general is something that as, people are increasingly hitting max level, things are starting to even out. We're seeing more people with comparable artifacts, comparable gear. We have a broader data set to draw upon to make some tweaks where they're needed.
Nice. Yeah, and I believe this next question actually kind of hits on that a little bit. In fact, it does. A question here from V Moda, who asked, considering we are 1 week into Legion, I would like to ask you what the plan is regarding balance. Will there be more frequent updates and fixes?
So yes, I guess I'm not sure. People may have different definitions of frequent. I
Sure.
think when it comes to class change, we'd rather let things bake for a little while and make class balance changes in a bundle rather than doing a whole bunch of little one-off fixes where we tweak one ability for one spec and then a few days later tweak something else for some other spec.
Right.
We want to give a chance, as I was just saying a moment ago. Now that people are hitting max level, we're getting more and more of that data that's going to be invaluable for us to balance things. And as raids open up, that's something that will give us even more data.
Yeah.
I think it wouldn't surprise me. I think we're probably targeting a set of tweaks just before raids open, so maybe the end of next week, somewhere around there. We'll try to communicate those via hotfix notes in advance so they're not catching people by surprise. And I think the focus there is going to be mostly trying to bring up underperforming specs, though without being too disruptive to the sort of hierarchy of specs. We don't want to make someone feel like they made the wrong decision with their artifact. We just want to make sure that whatever decision you did make, you are viable and you feel like you can contribute and you're valued in a variety of situations. And I think the reality is, and we would love for balance to be perfect. Balance isn't right now, and we're working on it. But there are so many different variables. Not to make excuses, but making excuses. We've tried to pin things down as much as possible over the course of beta, but with as many changes as have happened to fundamental spec rotations, plus the added variables of all the different artifact traits, some legendaries people are starting to get now, and so forth. Players are definitely finding interactions, and in some cases new rotations or new priorities that weren't things we'd originally taken into account, and it's going to take us some time to sort through that and get to a good place of equilibrium.
Cool. Yeah. You mentioned artifact traits. Like I've seen several classes that have been saying like I was bad. Then I got this artifact trait and now I feel pretty good. Or just situations like obviously right now we have mostly 5-man's world quest. That's kind of the real PvE content right now. And then as soon as you get into a raid, all of a sudden. Like even with Warlocks, which we were talking about earlier, with that long ramp time, when a fight goes from being 2 minutes long to being 10 minutes long, the ramp time actually matters less.
Exactly, so. And I think the content that people care about balance most for, which is to say, Mythic Keystone Dungeons, raided PvP, raid content, none of that's available yet.
Right.
So that's also going to shake some things up when it happens.
So, I guess just to. I don't mean to stick on this question for too long, but just an extra sort of note in there is we don't want to make the wrong changes too early because we were doing like a knee-jerk reaction, like, oh God, change this guy and change this guy and change this guy. And then we have to go in as soon as raids open and go, okay, now they're just way overpowered. We need to nerf them again.
Exactly that. We'd rather be conservative rather than risking pendulum stuff or overshooting and having to pull things back. Also, finally, outside of just balance, I think there are mechanical tweaks, things that we want to do to improve gameplay for different specs, which really aren't appropriate for a hotfix. And so those are some things that players will start to see when the 7.1 PTR goes up and beyond. We know we made a lot of change here in 7.0. Internally, we kind of liken it to, if you think of a pond or a lake, we dropped a giant boulder into that lake, and there's going to be huge ripple effects that kind of will dampen out over time. But we know there's going to be iteration, and hopefully less iteration with each successive patch. But we have problems to solve. We're going to work on solving them and get to a place where there's a lot more stability.
Cool. Moving on. Next question from Grofu Millimi. I managed to pick questions from people that I can't pronounce their names, so I apologize for that. The question is pretty simple. When will Monk Roll be fixed? And obviously this relates to Demon Hunter Fell Rush as well as Flying Serpent Kick.
Yes. Hopefully very soon. We're actively working on it. I think in the most recent hotfix notes that went up, there was a hotfix that we're testing was in progress on it. That's still the case. We know that it's a miserable experience when your core abilities fail. So
when you're supposed to go from point A to point B, and instead you go from point A to point 8.1, like that obviously is not ideal. But it has been proving to be a difficult issue to fix. Moving on, question from Cladria, who asked, do you have plans to continue the Class Hall story in 7.1?
Not in 7.1. I think the story focus in 7.1, as we've laid out, revolves around the Karazhan dungeon. It revolves around wrapping up the story of Stormheim and Odin and Helya there, and then continuing the Suramar campaign, the Suramar chapters, to really learn more about the Nightfall and insurrection against the Grand Magistrix and the Nightborn in Suramar. There is more Class Hall story to tell, but that's going to happen later than 7-1.
Okay. Moving on. Next question comes from Illiterate, who asked, what's the reasoning behind the warrior class campaign taking significantly longer than other classes?
We screwed up. We're gonna speed up the time on some of those missions. There's a lot of there were a couple of bugs in the process. So the warrior campaign timing is actually the timing we intended for all classes.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. There were some last minute bugs that cropped up that actually, other class missions were supposed to, some of the shorter ones were actually supposed to have a cooldown after completing it before the next one would pop up. Like, if you remember, if you did shipyard missions for the legendary ring in 6-2, one of those would pop up every few days. They weren't constantly chaining into your log one after the other. And so the intent was for that to all even out. The thought was for it to be more like a 2-week process rather than a 5 to 7 day process. Obviously, the result of the bugs is that warriors get the short end of the stick. That's not a situation that we're going to keep that way.
Right.
Though, I think everyone who's been working on it at this point is getting to unlocking their 3rd relic slot. But we want to make sure that it's fair for people going forward.
Cool. Now, you shouldn't feel like warrior. You took the wrong choice for your relic slot.
Exactly.
Or anything. Cool. Next question from Flare79, who asked, quest logs overflowing. What can be done? It needs to be double or just remove the limit.
So yes, there's a lot of content in Legion, and we've seen people. I think I personally myself ran into a couple of situations where I hit the quest log limit, couldn't accept a new quest. Our biggest concern with raising the limit is that increasingly, if you imagine, all right, let's say we let you have 35, 40 quests, we can do that. It's that at some point it becomes incredibly unwieldy just to parse and keep track of all of those things. We see it more as we'd rather look at the underlying causes and ask why people are needing to have that many different quests in their quest logs. In some cases, it's because you're holding on to really old things that are just cluttering up your log. I think I personally abandoned a couple of quests that I'd still had in my log from Warlords that I told myself I was going to get around to one day, like in quests for my garrison. When I ran into that problem, you don't need those things in your log, and that's kind of what the limit's there for to some extent. That said, we recognize that, especially with the non-linear leveling in Legion, the ability to hop between zones, and the different sources of content like professions, order hall campaign stuff, it's quite possible that, you might have 3 quests pushed to you simultaneously as part of your order hall campaign, none of which we ever want you to abandon, but they're also things you're not going to complete right away. It's things like do those next 5 missions or complete this number of world quests or go to this dungeon and get this thing. So one thing we could investigate in the future would be having some special story quests that we know we don't ever want you to drop not count towards that limit. That way, we can kind of not work against that. But we've at max level, world quests as opposed to the daily quests that we had in the past don't show up in your log at all.
Right.
So I think there's definitely a hump that once you get over, it stops being a problem. I think my own personal experience hitting 110 was definitely this sense of wow, I have a lot of stuff in my log, and then I kind of worked through the profession quests that I had built up. I hit up those dungeons to finish those dungeon quests that had still been lingering there, and then got to a point where it was pretty much Suramar campaign stuff and not too much else that was coming in and being added to the log. But we definitely recognize it's an awkward experience when it happens, so don't want to minimize that.
Yeah, for me, I found it was actually a lot of the sort of small side chains in Suramar that ended up causing the issue for me.
Yeah.
Because I would be on the way to do a world quest or something, and I'd go past the little exclamation mark and be like, oh, I should pick this up so that I remember to come back and do it later. And so I just ended up with a whole bunch of quests that I wasn't even working on, sitting in my quest log. All right. Here's a question from Corehard. This has been another popular one, asking, why is there any cross-realm zone in Legion's area?
Okay, so there's a whole lot of new technology that supports the way the outdoor world works in Legion. Some of this is what was really integral to ensuring a smooth launch experience. People who may remember around Draenor launch when we might have had 1,000 players in Frostfire or in Shadowmoon Valley. That's a terrible experience, both from a performance perspective, but also just from a gameplay perspective, because no matter how quick we make the respawn,
right,
a single quest area can't support 50 or 60 people all competing over the same sets of things. And so, we have the ability to we can break zones up and have multiple copies of a given zone running on a given server to get the population to roughly where we want it. But that also works both ways. When we talk about the optimal population for a zone, I think we don't want it to be too high, but we also don't want it to be too low. So I think whereas in the past we had drawn this line and said current content is only people from your own server by default unless they've manually joined groups, and we only use CRZ for older content. In Legion, both splitting up and merging are just a universal attribute of the entire world, and the value of that is a certain critical mass of population, both to make the world feel alive, but also so that when you're out world questing, particularly with the new shared tapping rules and whatever else, you actually want to run into other players a lot of the time. You want to get the sense that when you go to a world quest area or you're going to a major, quest boss or a rare spawn that you've come across, there are people around who can help you out, and you'll have those experiences throughout the expansion's lifespan rather than just early on when everyone is leveling simultaneously and hitting the same bottlenecks and zones, and then later on things feel much more dead. Obviously, I know there's some negative experiences that people have on PvP servers where they're on PvP servers, but they've been accustomed to not ever having to PvP on their PvP servers because they're 95% Horde or 95% Alliance, and now suddenly wait, there's these other server people of the opposite faction that are out there. I get how that may not feel like a positive interaction, but that in many ways is also restoring the sense of what PvP servers are supposed to be about.
Yeah.
And that is faction conflict. So understood, but intended.
And I do know that with regard to the PvP situation, the world PvP situation, I do know that we're looking into some of the bodyguard abilities that are...
Yes.
There's one that's a 20-second channeled stun or something, and that we tend to say everything goes in world PvP. Almost everything goes in world PvP.
Exactly. Those are all oversights, and there's a hotfix in the works, I think, to make those obey more standard PvP rules, which includes PvP durations, but also being able to trinket out of them and use standard mechanic breaks to counter them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the negative experiences people are having with those right now is because there's some paladin with the Dreadlord looking dude who stuns them for 15 seconds, and the paladin's just lol, just beating the crap out of them the entire time.
Exactly.
So.
Not intended, not fun.
All right. Moving on, question from Tweakin, I think is how this is pronounced, who asked, what was the reason behind gating the Suramar quests and story behind a rep grind when none of the other zones required any such thing to get the full experience and story?
So I guess... I don't know that I would agree that it's a rep grind, though I know that for some people, if there's a reputation bar that you have to fulfill, it's automatically a grind.
Right.
I think it's very different from some reputations in the past where you just had to kill mobs in a field to get it, or you were doing 10 daily quests a day to get your Claxi rep up or whatever, for specific rewards that were power items that were gated behind that. Here, I think the biggest differences are, first off, it's an endgame max level zone, which we've never quite done before. The stories of the other zones were meant to be experienced sort of in one go as you're leveling through them, whereas as we know that at max level, there is a ton to do. There are a bunch of different objectives to pursue. You're doing profession stuff, you're getting into PvP, you're running dungeons, you're doing world quests, and Suramar and the campaign of Suramar, something that we wanted to sort of pace out so that it can compete more cleanly, I guess, with those other things, and you're kind of cycling back and forth between doing Suramar and doing other types of content. For most people, especially at this stage, the bulk of the reputation that you're getting isn't actually from repeatable sources. It's from just playing through one-time quests throughout the zone, all the little things hidden in the nooks and crannies of the zone as you're learning more about the culture of the Nightfallen, about the people of Suramar. Then, of course, it's going to be supplemented with world quests, with your emissaries, with the Withered training scenario.
Yeah.
And you'll be unlocking more world quests and more content along the way that will in turn give you more rep. So I think we just wanted to tell an epic story that has a lot of heft to it that will span a significant amount of time, and Reputation serves as a pretty good way of pacing that out, and also lets players learn about and get a feel for the nature of this society as they're unlocking the story as kind of a storytelling aid.
Cool. Yeah, and like you say, a lot of it does just kind of come somewhat naturally. Like, it's something that you can look at and say, oh, this is obviously a grind. I need to go, because there are a few mobs that do give you rep if you kill them, if I remember correctly. I haven't purposefully sought them out myself, so that may be incorrect.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Not any repeatable way for Nightfallen.
Okay, cool. But it can be the sort of thing you look at and you say, now I need to go and find all of the different ways to get Reputation for this because I got this quest that said reach Revered with the Nightfallen or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly just do the content of Suramar to unlock more content of Suramar. And a reputation bar is a very handy way of communicating that, rather than sort of more invisible requirements that are harder to express what you have to do to get to the next stage.
Yeah, maybe worth thinking about it from the perspective of once I hit the next rep. Once I do hit the next rep, I should come back and do more stuff here, not necessarily I need to work as hard as possible to get
and
to
I think right now there are some people who are working specifically towards unlocking the Suramar dungeons. But I mean, we're seeing people already doing that, and it takes about a week and a half of intensive Suramar questing, which isn't that huge in the grand scheme of things. We deliberately positioned that unlock, 2/3 of the way through Honored. There's plenty of rep beyond that, but that really is mostly just for story, cosmetic rewards, and a couple of items. But that's not something that I would imagine is going to be a driving goal for other players. It'll be more something that just happens organically as you play a bunch of Suramar. Next thing you know, you're revered and you're unlocking the next chapter. But it's very different than it was, let's say, in Mists, where you couldn't spend your Valor points until you got to a certain threshold, and that was a much harder gate.
Yeah. You mentioned the dungeons just a second ago, and we have another question here from Brandon RF94, who asked, will Suramar Reputation be account-wide? Getting alts attuned for the 2 mythic-only Suramar dungeons could be painful.
No plans to make it account-wide. I think in general we want character progression to be something that the character does, and part of playing an alt should be about earning power, earning access to things, and earning the same things that you would on your main. Pacing-wise, I mean, certainly down the line we can take a look at the reputation required if it feels like it's a high barrier to entry. Maybe months from now it's lower rep requirement to get in, though as I just said, we're seeing that there's already tons of pre-made group finder groups forming. If you just search for dungeon groups, you'll see a lot of Quarter Stars and Arcway groups, and more people are getting in there, and we're just a week and a half into the expansion, so it doesn't feel like it's this impossibly distant, unattainable goal.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Like we're talking about an expansion that's been out for a week and a half. And it will be out for much longer than another week and a half. So
a little bit.
Yeah. So I know everyone wants to get right into the tasty new content right away, but sometimes it's okay for things to take a little bit longer to get into. Moving on, next question from Krills, who asked, are you going to increase rep earned with various factions, or are you happy the way they are? Got all sorts of rep questions for you.
Honestly, pretty happy with how things are so far. World quests give you a good chunk of rep. If it's your emissary for a given faction for a given day, that's going to give you a huge amount if you just do those 4 world quests. Then other than that, if you're particularly interested in a given rep, just keeping an eye on the world quests popping up in that zone will give you steady progress towards those goals. And again, I think a lot of the high-end rep goals are more for cosmetic and prestige sorts of things, achievements and long-term unlocking flying and whatnot, and less this power item that I must have ASAP.
Right. All right, moving on. Question here from Bladebuster, who asks, Kosumoth, what inspired you guys to add this puzzle to Legion?
An awesomely creative design team, honestly. It's cool to have mysteries and secrets in this world of data mining and everything kind of coming out during PTRs, during betas. Kosumoth was actually, I think he was spawned on beta, but the puzzle to unlock him was actually disabled for the entirety of beta. We just tested it internally so that it wouldn't leak out,
get figured out ahead
during the beta cycle.
Yeah.
We weren't entirely sure if it actually, there was a while where we figured that it was actually too obscure we were like, wow, how is anyone ever going to do this? And so, our world is vast and full of secrets, but we also, can never underestimate the resourcefulness of our community. I think when they crowdsource the problem and work together as a group, scouring the world for these orbs and spreading out to try to interact with them in various ways, something that would probably be pretty much impossible for one person to ever unravel on their own became manageable. So it's been really fun seeing the player excitement and enthusiasm around it. We are working on a hotfix to make the orbs more multi-interact friendly.
Right.
That's something that there are a couple of wrinkles. We want to make sure that we don't inadvertently break them the way we broke the spyglass back in Draenor, because hotfixing object interaction is more complex than you would think because of client caches and stuff like that. But as soon as we can get a fix that we're comfortable with out in players' hands, we will. And then more people who want to follow in the footsteps of the intrepid explorers who found this in the first place can do so.
And what I thought was really cool about this particular story is that the people that unlocked this were actually looking for something else entirely, which I believe as of this morning they'd figured out the other thing as well. And so it's cool. And there's a lot more hidden stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, seeing
Legion,
all the discussions
obviously.
about hidden artifact appearances and
Hidden what now?
hidden artifact appearances and different specs, theorizing and searching for how theirs might be obtained. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Question here from Virel, who asked, am I ever penalized for queuing 2 artifact knowledge orders at once, or does the system adjust the days to keep in line with the catch-up mechanic? I've seen a lot of just general confusion about this. I know a lot of people, when they first hit level 110, they queued up 2, and they saw the first one was 4 days, but then they added a second one, and it said everything will be completed in 9 days. I said, wait, hang on, math. What's going on here?
Right. So I think the way the catch-up mechanic works here is that there's this sense of like the maximum knowledge that you could ever have, which is if you hit 110 on the 30th within the first day and you started working on your knowledge, it was a 5-day work order right away. If you hit 110, let's say that following weekend, and you're at least a few days behind, your work orders are 4-day work orders instead of 5 to kind of get you caught up to within a few days of the very vanguard. And if you're even farther behind, if someone comes along 2 months from now, let's say, and they make an alt or they hit max level for the first time, they're going to see 3-day work orders for a while just to kind of get them caught back up. So what they were probably seeing was, the first 4-day was them being a bit behind, but then that was going to catch them up to roughly on par with the front runners, and that's why that happened that way. In general, I would just say don't overthink it. I know it's like there's a lot of the artifact system and how does knowledge work and all of this that can sound complicated if you try to dissect all of it. Just earn your artifact power, spend your artifact power, keep knowledge studies queued up whenever possible. The reason why we let you queue 2 up is so that you never feel like you have to log on at the precise moment that your last one completed to start the next one, otherwise you're falling behind. So if you just hit max level, queue up 2, and every time 1 is done and you collect it, you re-queue the second, you'll be behaving optimally.
Yeah. I never want to say no, there's no bugs here definitively, because you never know. There could always be something.
It's possible, but we understand. Like, we haven't heard anything that we can't explain with how the system works.
It seems like the system is working how it's supposed to, and there's no weird extra like, oh, don't queue up your second artifact knowledge because it'll take longer sort of mechanic going on, which is good to know. I've actually seen a lot of people that were confused about that. Question from Sam M155, who asked, will you be adding more new features to the companion app?
Potentially. I mean, I think it's certainly it's been awesome seeing the enthusiasm that the companion app was met with. Tons of people have been making use of it, and it's a nice fit for keeping track of world quests and managing your order hall champions, while you're away from your computer. If there are features that make sense, that's something we'd love to continue doing, and I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis. I think in the short term, I know there's definitely some awkwardness having a separate armory app from the Legion companion app, so I could see us taking steps to integrate those, but everything is going to involve work and a timeline associated with it.
Yeah, and I know I was talking with a couple of the guys that were working on the app. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because you're assistant game director, I'm the community manager. But I know that they were talking about some certain things like artifact knowledge is one that people have asked about a lot. Yes. And we do want there to still be reasons for you to go to your order hall in the actual game. It's not meant to replace your order hall. It's just meant to be a good way for you to kind of keep up with some of that stuff while you're away.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's basically that. Philosophically, I don't know that there's necessarily a specific objection that we have to adding knowledge, for example. I think it's
Okay.
more that, the app ideally is something that we'd like to position as something that you're using when you're away from your PC. When you can't play, you can keep tabs on what's going on and keep up with things. But if it's replacing an in-game interaction when you're actually sitting at your computer, if it feels like the right thing to do is to pull out your phone and log off, that starts to feel weird to us. But that said, where it makes sense and where it's not, infringing upon the core of World of Warcraft as a PC MMO, offering these conveniences, it seems just like win-win to us.
Cool. All right, next question comes from Jinjang or Yin Yang, depending on how you want to pronounce your J's. Question is, what's the future of artifact weapons after Nighthold? Will there be new traits, slots, or something like that added in the future?
There will be something like that added in the future. No, I mean, we have some ideas. Our artifact power and artifact progression are something that we really want to span the entire expansion. We want there to never be a point where you don't care about artifact power. I mean, part of its value really is as this universal endgame reward that no matter what you're doing, whether you're doing raids, dungeons, outdoor content, PvP, you're getting some. And even if you had bad loot RNG, you didn't get the drop you wanted, you at least can say, okay, got some artifact power, then I'm progressing towards a tangible goal. We want to see how the system continues to play out, which will inform the decisions we make and which of the several options that's on the table we go with for future patches. But there will be extensions of the artifact progression system going forward.
I do think it's important to look at this, look at artifact power especially, as it does kind of need to be something that you still want through the whole expansion to some extent. Because like systems like World Quest, for example, like there's pieces of gear every once in a while that show up that I look at and I'm like, oh, that's a big upgrade. But no matter what, I know that if I were to log into the game right now, if I were to shut off this stream for some reason and go log into the game right now, there would be at least a few world quests I could go do that would give me artifact power, and there would absolutely be something valuable for me there. So I think it's good to have something like that that's always going to be useful.
Yep.
Cool. Moving on. Another artifact power related question comes from Lishaza, who asked, is there any plan to allow players to carry over artifact power to a different spec if they find they don't enjoy it at max level?
No, no plans to transfer artifact power between weapons. I think the main thing is that the way knowledge works, and as players have already seen, what matters most for developing your weapon is the actions that you've taken most recently, within the last week or two. Once you hit max level, you'll find that the artifact power available at max level. Like I think this morning I just did a 680 artifact power quest up in Stormheim. That is enough to buy multiple traits in
Note
a brand.
to self,
Yes,
go do that quest.
in a brand. It's on the like elite Hellarjar
Cool.
Kvaldir Island in the northeast. But yeah, like once you hit max level, you can trivially get the first 13 or so traits in your other weapons without much sacrifice. And as knowledge ramps up, it will make it much easier to catch up and switch over. So let's say if you've been playing Fire Mage for the first few weeks and you decide that you actually want to go Frost or Arcane later on, it'll probably just take you a week or two for your weapon to surpass where your old one was. And I think there have been some helpful guides that other sites have put out looking at exactly what the difference is in trying to maintain two weapons or three weapons versus just one, and really like making that switch. You have a short-term shortfall of like maybe 1 to 2% power, if that. Yeah. And that's a gap that will shrink over time.
Yeah, it's easy to look at the costs and feel like it's super daunting. But in a lot of ways, actually, those costs work out to be advantageous towards wanting to like. So, for example, it's funny you mentioned Fire Mage and then trying out another spec. So I leveled as Fire Mage, and I got my artifact to 13, got my first golden trait, and I was like, okay, I like Fire. I kind of get what it's like, but I kind of want to try Arcane instead. And I was looking, and so I guess tip for people, the 14th trait costs 6,840 artifact power. Getting an artifact to 13 costs very slightly less than that.
Yep.
So once you get that first golden trait and you get to that point where it's like it starts that ramp up, if you want to try another spec, go for it, because it's only going to take you like a day or so to get back to the same spot.
It's people who weren't on beta, may not have an appreciation for just how much artifact knowledge will ramp up over time.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a very exponential system. You'll find yourself 2 months from now looking at your world quest map and seeing it littered with 5,000 and 6,000 artifact power world quests. And so the decisions you're making now, like obviously they're very impactful to your gameplay experience today. But a month from now, if you decided that you really wanted a different spec, there rapidly wouldn't be a meaningful difference between the version of you that stuck with it all along and the version of you that changed your mind a month in.
Cool. It's actually like I'm not so hot on the math, but I know looking through it, like seeing all the math and seeing other people that have worked it out, I'm like, okay, actually this actually works out to be pretty good. So cool. Another question here from Flare79, who asked, Auction House is a mess. There's so many 400 stacks of one listings. Why not limit stack of 100 or less to 20 and unlimited 100 plus stacks? So there's lots of numbers in this question, which made my brain go a little bit squiggly. But
AH is a mess pretty much sums it up.
Yeah.
I think that's the important part of the question. Yeah, it is. Our auction house, our in-game default auction house UI is pretty unacceptable at this point. It's something that I think is past due for a revamp. You know, every time around we have to make decisions and decide what to prioritize and what pieces of our UI we're going to work on. You know, this time around we did a lot of things with stuff like nameplates. We of course added the all new transmog UI and so forth. But it's eye-opening in a bad way when you get your profession quest as a blacksmith or leatherworker and it says, well, bring me 40 laystone ore, and if you're not a miner, go to the auction house.
Yeah. And
then you just see page after page of one stacks, and you have to go through so many clicks. It's pretty rough. One thing we're doing, but that's going to be a slightly longer term project, unfortunately. I hate to recommend add-ons, but in the meantime, something like Auctionator or the like is pretty solid and lightweight.
There are some really good.
But that should not be the answer. Like that's a failing on our part if you feel like you need that to use a basic piece of the game's functionality. That said, we're looking at some changes in patch 7.1 to the logic of how items are sorted and displayed on the auction house. I think a big part of why you see so many one stacks is that we currently sort by absolute total stack value. And so, you know, a one stack of ore for 10 gold will get sorted before a 5 stack of ore for 20 gold. Even though the 5 stack is actually 4 gold per ore, and the 1 stack is 10 gold per ore, the system is just saying, well, 10 is smaller than 20. In 7.1, we're hoping to be able to sort just by unit price so that you'll see the cheapest stuff first, regardless of stack size. The reason why we wouldn't want to limit stack size too much is that a lot of the time, well, I only might need 5 ore. I might have 15 and need 5 more to complete my quest or to craft the item that I want to make. And if I can only buy it in stacks of 20 or 100 or something, I might have that it may involve overspending significantly, which might not matter on something like cheap ore, but might be a really big deal when you start talking about more expensive materials.
Yeah. And even just that subtle change can actually change behavior a lot. So you end up seeing, because right now a lot of people just sort of understand one stacks sell more often.
Exactly.
And so, that can be part of why the one stacks sell more often.
The hope is that by just showing the cheapest stuff, we'll remove a lot of the incentive that people have to spam up the auction house with one stacks.
Cool.
Which will help it for everybody.
Excellent. Another related question here from 89 Adam Ray, who asked, are there any plans to improve the guild finder / search system in the game?
Yep, this is an area that definitely needs some work. It's probably more of a future expansion type feature than something we're going to do in a patch because it's a pretty significant overhaul that's required. But for a game where social elements are as important as they are to WoW, we can do a much better job of trying to connect you with like-minded players with similar schedules, with similar goals, out of the millions that are playing our game.
Right. Cool. We're starting to run short on time, so I'm going to try and get through these remaining questions as quickly as possible. Question here from Cool as Ice, who asked, any change or fix about Dalaran Underbelly PvP problem in PvE realms?
So, until recently, the Underbelly was definitely overpopulated, which was compounding a lot of these issues. We probably could have done a better job, and we'll look at how we can improve this, of messaging the fact that there is a guard captain available who will rent out bodyguards for the low price of 5 gold that protect you from PvP even when the sewers are in chaos mode. The intent was not like this is a place where you must go and you can't opt out of getting killed by other players. But we also did want to explore this sort of seamy underbelly of the big city of Dalaran and chaos happening down there. So, it's there are a few things that will send players there who don't want to be there, but those things do exist. It's specific profession quests, things like that. The short-term answer for those people is, to buy a bodyguard, and it's on us to make it more apparent that that's how that functionality works.
Yeah.
And then once you're done with that, if you don't want stuff like the Rat Stallion, if you don't want the rewards that are down there, and you don't like the gameplay, then you should steer clear of the underbelly.
Yeah. And it's worth noting as well, just you mentioned the bodyguards. We've gotten some reports about the bodyguards like leaving early. We're looking into that. Not entirely sure what's causing that. So if you do have, if that does happen to you, it seems to be very uncommon. But if that does happen to you, details on what was going on at the time would be super helpful.
Definitely.
Question from Dranalath, who asked, will the small amount of artifact power awarded in PvP be fixed so that it's equal to the collection rate of artifact power, in PvE?
PvE is very, very broad, obviously, right? Ranges from everything from normal dungeons to world quests to high-end raiding. We're looking at artifact power gains. Definitely, as we get more data, we're going to take a step back and make sure that there aren't any huge imbalances. Part of why we started out conservative with PvP in particular is that skirmishes and arena matches in general are something that you can spam very quickly and really churn through a lot. And it's much easier to buff than it is to nerf with that type of system.
Right.
So we were trying to be conservative out the gate. When rated PvP becomes available, that's going to be a more lucrative source of artifact power. But our intent is that if you are a dedicated PvP player and that's just what you want to do with your time, that should be a totally viable path towards leveling your artifact and unlocking all its traits.
Cool. Next question here from Sturka, who asked, with the extended delay before we see a raid tier with actual tier gear, can we expect more tiers without sets involved? So obviously, Nighthold is unlocking at some point in the future.
Yes.
And that's the first tier with an actual tier set, because both Emerald Nightmare doesn't have an actual tier set, and obviously the 3-boss Trial of Valor raid doesn't have a tier set as well. So is that something we can expect to see more often?
Potentially. I don't know about more often. I guess more often in the sense that we do a non-zero number of interesting little one-off raids that we haven't done as much recently. We recognize that sort of the big plot anchors of major zones, like spoilers, when we're eventually going to go to the Tomb of Sargeras at some point in this expansion. You're probably going to get some tier armor when you're raiding in the Tomb of Sargeras.
Right.
But if we make another smaller raid or something that's not as part of that huge structure, there doesn't necessarily need to be a tier set. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Cool. Next question here from Critigree, who asked, do you have any control over what world quests spawn, or does the system randomly select them?
Yes. A bit of both, basically. I mean, we're not manually pushing buttons to turn on world quests. There's randomness, but there's a whole bunch of different buckets that we're picking from randomly to ensure reasonable distribution of world quest types, world quest locations across the world, different reward types. That's data controlled on our end, but there is a random process that's picking from those predefined buckets.
Yeah, there's no designer sitting at their desk going, I'm going to make him do the Squirrel Nut quest again. All right. Question here from Blood Guzzler. This has also been a really popular one. I'm glad that we got to it. Who asked, are there any plans to apply the scaling technology found in Legion leveling to holiday content, such as quests and bosses, allowing a greater range of player participation? We've seen a lot asking about, are you going to apply it to earlier zones? What about holiday content?
I think holiday content is a great fit for this sort of thing, very much like Demon Invasions. Like, they're designed to be kind of game-wide events. We haven't done it yet, but that's a great suggestion and something we're very likely to do.
Awesome. Straight and to the point. Question here. This may have to be our last question. Comes from Stephen Guyan22, who asked, how do you plan to pace content rollout compared to previous expansions?
Better.
Is that the answer?
Better. No.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we want to avoid feast or famine type stuff. We want to avoid front loading too much content and having long droughts. I think we want to deliver a steady stream of content as part of an Epic Legion experience, as part of an Epic Legion story that is only just beginning. We have a lot more story to tell. We're really excited to tell it. We can't wait, for people to get there and see what we have to offer. We want to experiment with some more different types of patches. patches that don't necessarily have to revolve around a giant raid zone or have something for everybody, but that are just, adding new systems, adding new features where it makes sense, updating existing ones, giving something new, something exciting, and a new way to interact with the world, and making the game feel alive throughout the lifespan of Legion. It's something we feel very strongly about, and we feel confident in our plan to pace the content out better than we have in the past.
Cool.
And it's something that we really are prioritizing.
Yeah.
And for real this time.
Yeah.
Honest.
Well, yeah,
we mean it.
It's something that, even before I was at Blizzard, it's something that I've heard a lot in the past. But it's important to note that every time we've said that, and every time that we've not quite been able to deliver on it, we've learned important lessons about why. So this time around, we've accounted for a lot more in that. Cool. I think this is a cool question. If you want to take one more real quick. It's just a quick question, hopefully, from Horde Balloon, who asks, do world quests scale with item level, or will they just become trivially easy for greater rewards? He's obviously talking about his own item level and how strong his character gets.
I mean, yeah, the once you're max level, the world isn't scaling with your gear. I think there's a couple of problems you run into if we try to do that. Both, I guess, different people between the person who's a fresh 110 and the person who's a raid geared 110 are still fighting the same mob in the same place. We could use some type of scaling, I guess, like we do for leveling up to normalize those things. But I think that would go too far in undermining the core sense of power progression that's part of an MMO. The stuff that was challenging for you in Suramar, those world quest bosses that you had a tough time with when you first hit 110 in greens, when you come back with Mythic Dungeon gear, we want you to kind of crush them a little bit. We're making sure the rewards stay relevant, but really the intent is that the content is something that you out-gear and out-power eventually. Now, that said, that's why we add new content. That's why we take you to new places. And just as you saw in Warlords, when we went to Tadon Jungle in 6.2, the baseline creature in Tadon Jungle was much tougher than the baseline creature in the rest of Draenor, because we knew that it was a place for people who had much higher item level coming in, and the rewards were structured accordingly. I think that's where that difficulty progression of the outdoor world is going to come from in Legion.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm not going to take any more of your time. Thank you so much for coming here today and answering these questions. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. We don't have a nailed down date for our next Q&A just yet, but we are in the planning stages for one. So there will be another Q&A in the near future, probably sometime in October will be the next Q&A that we do.
Yeah, ideally, I'd love to do these regularly, right? It's a great chance to just kind of field questions on a wide array of topics and just get information out to the community. And they're always really fun to do.
Absolutely. And if he wants to do them, then we'll do them. So, all
right. Good.
Thanks for hanging out today. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Take care.